All right, today we are diving deep into one of the most brutal survival stories you will ever hear. We're going straight to the source, the actual journal of Captain John Franklin. And let me tell you, this isn't some grand story of discovery. It's about what happens when human beings are pushed well past their breaking point in one of the most unforgiving places on Earth.
You know, just one sentence right here, it just says it all. It was written in a moment of complete and utter desperation, and it really gets to the heart of the Coppermine expedition of 1821. This was supposed to be a journey to map the northern coast of America, but it ended in starvation, murder, and yes, even cannibalism.
So picture this. It's late August 1821. They've done it. They've charted hundreds of miles of Arctic coastline. Captain Franklin and his men turn back inland, heading for their winter base, a place called Fort Enterprise. You'd think the worst was over, right? They survived the Arctic Ocean. But no, the real nightmare, the journey home, that was just about to begin. Now you have to understand, these canoes were everything to them. They were these big but incredibly fragile birch bark boats. They were their only way to cross the countless rivers on their path. And then just like that, a bit of bad luck, a line snaps in a fast-moving current, and their lead canoe is just smashed to bits against the rocks. This was a catastrophic blow. It basically stranded them, forcing them to hike overland through this desolate, barren landscape where there was absolutely no game to be found. And from there, it was like a domino effect. One disaster just led right into the next. They have another canoe accident, and this time Franklin himself loses his personal journal. I mean, can you imagine? All of his scientific observations, his maps, just gone, sunk to the bottom of a river. Then, the hunters. They start coming back with nothing. The caribou, their main food source, had already migrated south for the winter. And then the inevitable happened. Their last bag of flour was used up. Their rations were completely gone. With every single setback, these men were being pushed closer and closer to the edge. Okay, so let's get into it, because what happens next is the reason people still whisper about this expedition. With absolutely nothing left to eat, their menu, well, it became a list of things you can't even imagine calling food. Pure, unadulterated desperation.
They started eating things that offered almost zero nutrition. They were literally scraping lichen off of rocks. They called it tripe de roche, and boiling it into this awful, slimy mush. They started digging up the carcasses of deer that had been killed months earlier, boiling the rotting hides and chewing on the burnt bones just for a hint of flavor. And then, they did the thing that would make Franklin a legend. They started eating the spare leather from their boots.
This line from the journal, wow, it just perfectly illustrates a horrifying truth about starvation. I mean, think about it. The men were freezing to death, but the cold wasn't just coming from the outside anymore. Without food, without calories to burn, their bodies couldn't produce any heat. They were literally freezing from the inside out. It's a kind of cold that no amount of clothing or blankets could ever protect you from.
The physical suffering was just one part of it. The mental breakdown was just as bad, if not worse. As their bodies wasted away, their minds went with them. Franklin wrote about how they became confused, dizzy, constantly weak. The reality of their situation, the starvation, the dying, it was so horrific that their minds just kind of shut down. It was almost like a defense mechanism, this mental fog that kept them from fully grasping the nightmare they were living in. So the group as a whole was barely moving. The weakest men were slowing everybody down, and a terrible choice had to be made. A choice that seemed necessary for anyone to survive. The party had to split up.
Franklin decided to take the handful of men who could still walk and make a desperate push for Fort Enterprise. The hope was they could get there and send a rescue party back. So they left behind the sickest members. This included a brilliant young officer, Midshipman Robert Hood, who was literally too weak to even stand. Staying with them to care for them was Dr. Richardson and also their Iroquois guide, a man named Michel Terahaute. And here's the key part. Michel was the only one who still had any strength left to hunt.
And what happened in that little camp, it's probably the darkest, most terrifying part of this whole story. For over a week, they starved. Then, Michel comes back from a hunt, but he doesn't have a deer. He has this strange meat. He says it's from a wolf he killed. The very next day, Dr. Richardson finds Mr. Hood dead in their tent, shot through the head. 3 days later, convinced that Michel was a murderer, Dr. Richardson took out his pistol and shot him dead.
You have two completely different stories here. Michel's story was that Hood's death was a tragic accident, that his gun went off while he was cleaning it. But Dr. Richardson, He saw the truth, or what he believed was the truth. The bullet wound was in the back of Hood's skull. How does that happen by accident? Michelle became moody and evasive, and that's when this horrifying suspicion began to form in Richardson's mind. That wolf meat? It wasn't wolf at all. It was probably the flesh of one of the other men who had already died or disappeared. In his journal, Dr. Richardson tried to make sense of his decision. In the language of the time, he basically came to believe that Michelle, without a, quote, Christian moral compass, had snapped under the pressure. He became convinced Michelle was secretly killing off the weaker men one by one, and that he and the last survivor, John Hepburn, would be next. Fearing for their own lives, he felt he had no other choice. It was an execution, an act of justice and a place where all the rules of civilization had just disappeared.
So meanwhile, Franklin's group is having its own private hell. They are half dead themselves, barely able to walk, stumbling through the snow. And then, finally, they see it. Fort Enterprise. They thought they were saved. They were expecting food, warmth, salvation.
But they found nothing. Absolutely nothing. The fort was empty. It was abandoned. There was no food, no supplies, and worst of all, no sign of the local tribe who were supposed to have stocked it for their arrival. It was just a cold, desolate tomb. You can just feel the despair in Franklin's words. It was a feeling deeper than just hunger. It was the feeling of being completely abandoned, of being left to die by the very people who were supposed to help them. The only thing they found was a note from another officer, Mr. Back, who had gone on ahead. The note just said he was going to try and find the tribe. It offered zero immediate hope, just more crushing uncertainty.
So they were trapped in this frozen cabin. The last few survivors just began to wait. A little while later, Dr. Richardson and John Hepburn showed up, the only two to survive from the rear guard. This handful of men were now so weak they couldn't even hunt or gather firewood. All they could do was huddle together for warmth, reading from the Bible, as one by one their friends died around them.
And in their final days, this really strange thing happened. Starvation started to make them petty. Franklin wrote that they'd get into these anxious, fretful arguments over the most trivial things, like who deserved the warmest spot by the fire. Their minds were failing. The bonds of fellowship that had gotten them this far were just completely breaking down as their bodies began to shut down for good.
Just as it seemed like all hope was finally gone, when the last few men were just lying there waiting to die, a flicker of something appeared on the horizon.
It was them. Against all odds, Mr. Back had found the hunters. He had sent them back to the fort with food, and they arrived in the absolute nick of time. The survivors were so weak they could barely even speak. But they were saved. The impossible last-ditch rescue effort had actually worked.
11. That was the final count. 11 men from the expedition died on that return journey from the coast. They died of starvation, of exposure, or in the case of Hood and Michelle, of violence.
The scale of this disaster was just staggering. I mean, look at the numbers. Of the 20 men who started that trek back from the ocean, less than half of them, only 9, made it back alive. It remains one of the deadliest polar expeditions in history. When Franklin's journal was published back in England, it caused a sensation. He became an instant celebrity. The press gave him a nickname, the man who ate his boots. And really, that's what he was known for. Not for the incredible distances he mapped, but for surviving one of the most horrific ordeals a human being has ever recorded.
And so in the end, the story of this expedition just forces you to ask some really uncomfortable questions, doesn't it? Was Dr. Richardson a hero for doing what he had to do to survive? Or was he a cold-blooded killer? Was Michelle a monster driven mad by hunger? Or was he a victim too? It just leaves you with this legacy of incredible courage, but also of absolute horror, and this deep, profound moral gray area. It's a stark reminder of just how thin that line between civilization and savagery really is.